stop slipping, and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com. When it comes to Kangaroo leather football boots, simply put, Japan is on another level. And they don't even have kangaroos there. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the Adler Yatagarasu, handcrafted in Japan out of some of the finest materials that you'll find in the world of football boots at a price tag that you'd expect to pay for a pro-tier takedown model. Although it must be said that the boots are pretty well made to order and shipped directly out of Japan, so depending on where you live, they are going to end up costing you a little bit more, where the retail price for this football boot is just $160 US, which almost seems too good to be true, but after shipping, duties, and taxes to me in Canada, the final cost ended up being about $235 US, which admittedly is still really good value for money considering what you're getting, and I suppose in comparison to the only logical alternative in the made in Japan Mizuno Morelia 2, those are football boots that retail for $280, meaning that these Adlers are technically less expensive, although if you were buying either of these boots in Japan, both would be a heck of a lot cheaper. Pricing aside, if you consider yourself a leather football boot enthusiast, long story short, these Adlers should probably be on your radar. You guys have been telling me about these for a while, and to say the least, you were right. These are very impressive. Having said that, and like I always do, in today's video, I'm going to give you my brutally honest opinion on the Yatagarasu. I'm gonna say that name wrong at one point or another. We'll discuss the good, the bad, how they compare to the Mizuno made in Japan alternatives, and ultimately whether or not you should be considering a pair of Adlers if you're on the market for a new pair of leather football boots. So if you're interested in learning more, including how they fit and feel on feet, please stick around. And if you are interested in a pair for yourself, unfortunately, no SR4U discount codes with this one, but there will be a link to Adler's website down in the description. And really quickly, before we keep going, if you guys enjoy seeing reviews of boots outside of the big brands, I know a lot of you guys have been requesting this, and I do appreciate all of your suggestions down in the comments. A lot of people asking for ASICs. I'm working on that. Stay tuned. Drop a like on the video if you want to see more. And again, if you appreciate the unsugar-coated, unsponsored, brutally honest opinions on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. Where first things first, let's address the elephant in the room. Is the Adler Yatagarasu better than the made in Japan Mizuno Morelia 2? And I think the answer to that question could be yes, depending on personal preference, where definitely these two boots share a lot in common in terms of materials used and overall design, but at the end of the day, they still come across as being fairly different from each other. Where I'll talk about a lot of those differences throughout the video, but if you guys would like to see a direct comparison between the two in video form, let me know down in the comments and I can probably make that happen. Where if we start with the upper, you don't need to be an expert to see how soft this Kangaroo leather is, and the Kangaroo leather makes up the entirety of this football boot, something that we just don't see very often anymore. In the forefoot, it's soft, it's plush, it's incredibly pliable. You can see there's a bit of a dividing line right here and right here, basically at the end of the forefoot. Like we see with a lot of football boots, that transitions into what is a slightly thinner, less padded Kangaroo leather that then wraps pretty much all the way around the back of the football boot, with the only visible branding being the Adler logo right here on the back of the heel, and technically embroidered on the tongue, although with the laces tied, you don't really see it. With the minimal branding and all over stitching of the leather upper, definitely giving these football boots more of an old school aesthetic, which I think is a pretty fair way to describe the way that they fit and feel as well. But at the same time, if you were to compare this to, for example, a classic Copa Mundial from Adidas, these feel significantly more modern in the sense that the shaping, the width, and the volume is much more along the lines of what you'd expect from a pair of football boots in 2025. A pair of Copas, they kind of feel a little bit awkward out of the box and they require some wear time to stretch and form to the shape of your feet. Not the case here with the Adlers. The shaping, I think they've absolutely nailed, and with that nice deep central lacing system, the adjustability is top notch. Where, don't get me wrong, this is not a pair of football boots that you should buy expecting for this kind of second skin, barefoot, mercurial-esque feel. The lockdown and responsiveness is fine, but certainly this soft leather doesn't necessarily have the best structural integrity upon quick changes of direction. You're going to get that little bit of movement and that little bit of rollover that comes along with a full soft kangaroo leather upper, where again, the focus is very much on touch and comfort being consistent across the entire foot, rather than having the boots kind of hold your foot in place by way of added structure, where realistically they've prioritized the softness of the leather to the point where this boot can pretty much be pressed flat like it's melting, where the only reinforcement you're going to find being the nylon liner on the inside, which is pretty typical of most old school leather football boots, and plenty of stitching across the entire upper. Again, just to give it that little bit of extra structural integrity, but without taking away from the softness itself, which ultimately is what I think makes these football boots feel so good on feet. I don't want to dock points from them for not being as responsive as a pair of speed boots, because they're not trying to be a pair of speed boots. But as far as soft leather boots go, the structure, the fit, the feel, I think they've pretty much nailed it. There really isn't much that I would change about them there. Where specifically from a touch perspective, they didn't necessarily feel exactly as I was expecting, in the sense that the leather is definitely on the thinner side, particularly through the midfoot, but the forefoot still has that softness to it. They describe it on their website as having kind of a second skin feel. There's definitely more padding to these than what you'll find from most modern synthetic or textile-based upper football boots. These feel like proper kangaroo leather, and the touch on the ball is just super plush and very controlled. Where they do differ a little bit from what I was expecting, however, is the finish on the surface, which you can see is pretty highly glossy and actually a little bit grippier on the ball than most leather boots tend to be. Where again, if you're comparing this to a classic Copa Mundial, or honestly, even that made in Japan Mizuno Morelia 2, these just seem to offer a little bit of additional grip that, like I said, most leather football boots don't seem to have. Not to the point where they're sticky, don't get me wrong there, but I really like the finish, and it only enhanced that sensation of control that I think naturally comes along with the soft leather that you get across the entire foot. Across the top of the foot, you're going to find a nice deep central lacing system, where you can see that the lace holes themselves are actually staggered a little bit in kind of like a zigzag pattern, which is a very common design element of football boots out of Japan for whatever reason. I do think it helps with holding tension in the laces, but the difference that it makes at the end of the day, I think, is pretty minimal. I also like the fact that they give you that extra lace hole position at the top that's a little bit further back and deeper to help with holding your heel down and back inside of the football boots. If you're finding that you need that little bit of extra lockdown, it's nice that they include that. Everybody should on a pair of football boots. It just makes sense. And then as far as the tongue itself is concerned, if I loosen the laces, you can get a better look at that Adler embroidery. The tongue itself is also made from the same kangaroo leather as the rest of the football boot. As far as kind of like an anchor loop is concerned, you have a double loop pass through on the top of the tongue, which again is very Mizuno-esque and I think very common of Japanese football boots, to prevent the tongue from sliding from side to side, which I think it does very effectively. And then on the underside of the tongue, this is the one element that I'm not crazy about, where I don't want to call it cheap, but it's definitely a very old school thing. Pantofolo Doro uses this type of material a lot. It lines the underside of the tongue and feels perfectly fine, but it's just kind of like a foamy mesh is the best way that I can describe it. I think it would have been nice to see the same nylon as the rest of the inside of the football boot is lined with, but like I said, I didn't really have any issues with this. And then one last thing I wanted to comment on are the laces themselves, which might just be the most rugged laces I've ever seen in a pair of football boots. They're plenty thin and don't feel like they get in the way, but I would bet that these weigh twice as much as a normal pair, just based on how much material and how tightly woven they are. They genuinely feel like they'll last forever. Moving to the rear, you're going to find what is a pretty traditional low-cut construction. You have an internal plastic heel counter that I would say is above average solid for this style of football boot. Normally something old school and leather like this with this general aesthetic will have a much more malleable heel counter than this does, so I really like that design element of the Adlers in particular. The heel lining material is this really soft, super smooth material with plenty of padding along the edges as well as the upper part of the back of the heel, although down low there's pretty much no extra padding at all. The heel liner sits directly against that internal structure, which I was slightly concerned about at first when I pulled them out of the box, but after playing in the boots, it was not a concern whatsoever. I could not feel any lack of padding down low, and for the most part, the comfort and heel lockdown was about what I've expected, which is pretty decent. With the one thing about the design of the heel that I would say is that it is on the shallower side for, again, kind of an old school style of football boot, where if you were comparing the depth of the heel on these compared to, again, an old school pair of Copas, those are going to fit significantly deeper. The same thing can be said about, again, that Mizuno Morelia 2. So just something to be aware of, but certainly not an issue. The heel lockdown, like I said, was not a problem for me at all. And then if we look inside, the insole is fully removable, and they actually include two different ones. This being the more premium variant, and this being the very basic one that I'm not sure why anyone would really want to use unless you wanted to just have a little bit of extra depth in the heel, because this is significantly thinner than this one. These insoles, however, where there's not really much info about them on their website, it just says realign right here under the Adler logo, so I'm not sure if this is their own design and technology or if this is some kind of a collaborative effort with another company, but the insole itself is really nice. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that they're some of the nicer insoles I've ever found in a pair of stock football boots. What I like about it is the liner on the surface is this really soft microfiber, which feels really good and also does a good job of gripping your socks. And as you can see, it's got some contour to it, not just in the shaping of the insole around the arch, but you'll notice that it kind of has a bulge in the middle, and it even has a little bit of a heel structure with somewhat of an arch built in, where it's definitely thicker than what you're going to find from a lot of other insoles, and there's just more mass and material here through the midfoot, which, like I said, does raise your heel a little bit. So if you are struggling with depth in the heel when you put these on, I would definitely recommend trying them with the stock insoles, which are a lot less impressive. These are more or less insoles I'd expect to find in a much cheaper takedown model, but it's also not uncommon to find them in this style of football boot, so I can't really be mad at it, especially if they're including two different sets. But I really do like the feel of this insole. It has a little bit of that kind of orthotic sensation in terms of giving you a little bit of extra cushion and a little bit of extra support, particularly under the arch of your foot. So for that reason, I was just a big fan of it. However, I do have to point out, and I'm not sure if I just got a faulty pair. I'm honestly not even sure if this was here before I started wearing the boots. I just didn't pay that close attention, but now that I've worn them a few times, you can see that the liner is starting to peel away on the heel of the left insole. No issues with the right, and I'm not sure if it's going to get any worse, but definitely check your pairs when you do order a pair, just in case this is something that happens to you. Moving to the base, you're going to find a sole plate and stud pattern that is undeniably very old school looking, but with a bit of a twist. For starters, I really like the fact that it is nylon stitched all the way around. Again, it just goes to show the build quality and craftsmanship of these football boots, where you get what you pay for, and I think you can expect these boots to hold up pretty well in the long term. As far as the plastic sole plate itself is concerned, it's not really the whole story, because if you pull the insole out and look underneath, you'll notice what looks to be silver carbon fiber. It's not in fact carbon though, it is a Carvo material that they describe as a shank on their website, but it pretty much runs from heel to toe, and that is a modern material that, again, we see from Mizuno on their Made in Japan product line that they use for the sake of responsiveness. And in terms of springback, this definitely has more than what the average old school football boot would have. However, the Carvo in this situation is more so just to add some structure through the midfoot and heel to prevent what would otherwise be a pretty flimsy plastic sole plate from being overly flimsy. The end result is still that little bit of a springback sensation, but I will say when it comes to actually playing in the boots, it does come across as being relatively flexible in terms of feel, where I didn't experience that kind of speed boot-esque springback responsiveness that I think a lot of people might expect when they hear that the sole plate features that Carvo material. Regardless of that though, looks can be deceiving because for a sole plate that looks as traditional as this does, it actually feels quite modern. And then as far as the stud pattern is concerned, they've kept things obviously very traditional here, which I think is fitting for this style of football boot. As far as modern standards go, both in terms of stud shape as well as stud length, this maybe trends in more of a hard ground direction than it does a firm ground one, but I definitely found the traction to be adequate. And again, if you've played for a long time, you've probably had something traditional at one point or another. This is pretty much a copy and paste of that classic football boot stud pattern design. So you kind of know what to expect. Not super aggressive in terms of the traction on offer, plenty of stability, plenty of freedom to twist and pivot, but the studs, simply put, because of their shape, profile, and length, aren't necessarily going to provide that bite of some of the more modern stuff. Although I did find it pretty cool at how angled these front two studs are at the tip of the toe, which I actually think makes a lot of sense in terms of just giving you that perfect angle when pushing off. And I also found that when it came to just trying to scoop the ball up, these studs, because of the way that they're angled, just really got out of the way and made scooping the ball a little bit easier than it would be with something that has not only longer studs, but also studs of a different shape. So as far as design is concerned, again, it looks very simple, but everything is ultimately very well thought out. And then there's the weight, where let's be honest, if you're interested in these boots, you're probably not too concerned with how light or heavy they are, but I will say they're a little bit lighter than I was expecting them to be. This pair is a size 9 US or 27 centimeters, as they have the sizing listed on their website, which is a half a size smaller than I normally wear. We'll talk about that in just a second. And in the right boot, I have that kind of more orthotic style insole, which is just heavier. The left boot, I have the more thin, simple one, both included with the boots, by the way, if I didn't already mention that. Now, as you can see, with the lighter, thinner insoles, the boots weigh in at 8.8 ounces, the equivalent of 250 grams. We'll change the scale back to ounces. And with the thicker insole, which is how I've been wearing them, the boots weigh in at 9.4 ounces, the equivalent of 267 grams. Where certainly if you wanted the lightest possible feel, the thinner insoles are definitely the way to go, but personally for the extra 20 grams, I'll take the extra support and comfort with the thicker insole. As far as comparison is concerned, they're nowhere near as light as the Made in Japan Morelias, but they're a heck of a lot lighter than a pair of classic Copa Mundials. Again, not super heavy, not super light, and considering the craftsmanship and all over kangaroo leather that you get, I don't think too many people are going to be upset with how much these weigh. On feet, I'm definitely very impressed with the Adlers, although everything isn't necessarily perfect. The star of the show here is definitely the overall build quality of the football boots, the all-over soft kangaroo leather that just feels so good against your foot, that nice deep central lacing system that allows for great adjustability, and ultimately the shape that Adler have here. From a volume and width perspective, I think they've absolutely nailed it, where the fit feels incredibly good straight out of the box, and as you'd expect from any old school leather football boot, only gets better as you wear them in. With the sole plate also being a standout for this style of football boot in the sense that it's flexible, but at the same time it's nice and solid, where I think a lot of older style football boots with traditional sole plates can sometimes feel a little bit flimsy. That is definitely not the case here with the Adlers. Having said that, and like I talked about earlier in the video, the heel is definitely more on the shallow side than I was honestly expecting. And again, kind of something that's unusual for this style of football boot, where because there isn't any padding down low within the heel liner, depending on the shape of your heel, I could potentially see some minor issues with rubbing that could result in a blister if you played through any kind of pain long enough. Luckily for me, that does not seem to be an issue. And like I said, the heel lockdown as a whole seems to be pretty solid, all things considered, especially given that there really isn't much structure to this leather upper. So just something to be aware of. And then another minor thing, which I guess is somewhat annoying given that they are handmade football boots and I've been kind of complimenting the craftsmanship. But if you look at my right foot, all the stitching in the toe box and forefoot looks to be pretty straight, where if you look on the left foot, you can see it has a little bit of an angle to it. I'll put a picture on screen just so you can get a better side-by-side look of my right and left foot. And it's entirely possible that with wear, the left foot just stretched in that way compared to the right. I think that's fairly unlikely because I've personally never seen that before. And it doesn't seem to affect the shaping of the football boot. They both feel the same. But it is, again, something to be aware of, where just when you do order a pair, check your pairs to make sure that everything is as it should be. As far as width and sizing is concerned, I definitely think that these trend in a wider direction, especially after some wear time, given that the Kangaroo leather is inevitably just going to continue to stretch at least a little bit as you wear them in, and the base shape as a whole is definitely not overly slim. So as long as you don't have exceptionally narrow feet, you should be pretty good here. Just don't expect, again, that tight mercurial-esque wrap. Just based on the shaping and the materials they've used, you're just not going to get that experience. But I do really like the shape and I find them to be very comfortable. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in a Japanese 27 centimeters or the equivalent of a 9 US, which, like I said, is half a size down than what I would typically wear in the vast majority of football boots. And that was definitely the right call. The boots fit pretty well perfect in terms of length. And like I always recommend when it comes to full leather football boots like this, you kind of want to get them to fit as snug as possible. Not a pair that you want to have extra growing room in, because the extra room will inevitably stretch out even more as you wear the boots, and then they're just going to end up feeling sloppy. So this is one of those pairs that you definitely want to get as tight as possible, where I think for the vast majority, going half a size down is the best way to achieve the right fit after the boots are broken in. So in conclusion, the Adler Yatagarasu is the real deal. From a brand that most people have never heard of, the build quality, the craftsmanship, the materials used, and ultimately the experience of playing in these football boots is about as good as you can get if you're after something with a premium Kangaroo leather upper. I think what makes the Adlers so cool, and again, similar to a made in Japan Mizuno Morelia, is despite the very old school aesthetic, they've done a very good job of incorporating modern elements into the boots that don't take away from that old school experience, but simply enhance it. This is a football boot that feels like it's ready to go straight out of the box and offers a level of touch and comfort that, simply put, most football boots these days cannot match. Having said that, I don't think everyone is going to love these boots. If you like that more modern, locked-in, techie, responsive feel, this is in a lot of ways the exact opposite of that. But if you just want a pure, simple Kangaroo leather football boot experience, there's no question this is one of the best boots that you could spend your money on.